They only really had conquest till about 130, which is when Emperor Hadrian builds the Wall of Hadrian, which is in Britain, and basically they said we're not going to expand any further. And that's actually one of the things that will cause the future. I know it's hundreds of years, but one of the things that actually causes the fall of Rome, because the more expansion, the more conquering is, the more wealth that comes in, the more you can fund everything. So once you kind of cut off that funding, you've cut off the flow of money. That was the part of the conversation on the James Altucher Show I most wanted to land carefully. And we covered so much ground in nearly an hour, I never fully developed it. Because here's the argument I wasn't building towards. Rome wasn't just an empire. Rome was a specific kind of empire. It was expansion-funded one. The business model required perpetual conquest. Each successful war returned slaves, tribute, land grants for veterans, and a fresh treasury that paid for the next war and the civil administration in between. The system worked because for roughly 600 years, there was always somewhere new to expand into. Then by 128, an emperor named Hadrian had made a decision no Roman expected. He stopped expanding. He pulled back from Mesopotamia. He built a wall in Britain. He stabilized the frontiers. He said the empire is the size it is now, and we're going to defend what we have rather than take more. That decision is the moment the financial model became structurally insolvent. The empire didn't know it yet, because the existing wealth was enough to sustain the appearance of solvency for centuries. The slow compounding decay started that day. The 348 years between Hadrian's Wall and the formal fall of Rome in 476 is the timeline of an expansion-funded business model that ran out of expansion and never figured out how to replace the model. This is the pattern I want to finish here. How do empires grow through conquest hit specific structural ceiling? Why that ceiling never looks like a ceiling at the moment you hit it? And what that tells you about any institution, Roman, American, corporate, or governmental, that's running on perpetual growth assumptions without recognizing it. I'm Jeremy Ryan Slate. This is the Roman Pattern. I'm the CEO of Command Your Brand. You can find us at commandyourbrand.com. If you came here from the James Altucher Show, welcome. James and I covered a lot of ground. Alexander the Great, the Roman kingdom through the Republic, through the Empire. Caesar, Augustus, the 3rd century crisis, Diocletian, Constantine, the Edict of Caracalla, the grain dole, and James's own pushback on whether America is really in decline. This video focuses on one specific thread underneath it all, the financial pivot at Hadrian's Wall, and the long compounding decay that followed. Before I get into the framework, I owe you a few corrections on the record. First, when I said Alexander the Great died at 33, he died at 32. The year 323 BC is right. Alexander was born in 356 and died in 323. He was 32, not 33. It's a small detail, but accuracy matters when the figure is as famous as Alexander. Second, when I attributed the gold solidus stabilization to Diocletian, that's not quite right. Diocletian did reform the bronze coinage and briefly introduce a silver coin called the argentus. But the gold solidus, the coin that became the long-lived standard of late Roman Empire and the Byzantine commerce, well, that was actually Constantine's reform around 312. The two reforms are often conflated because they're both part of a broader late Empire monetary restructuring. Diocletian started the work. Constantine finished the gold standard. The distinction matters because it's part of why Constantine's reign produced a generation of relative monetary stability, and Diocletian's didn't. Third, when I said Hadrian built the wall around 130, the construction started in 122 and was largely completed by 128. Hadrian's reign was 117 to 138. The wall is a visible marker of the policy decision, but the policy decision was made earlier, almost immediately upon Hadrian taking the throne. The date matters because the entire thesis I'm about to walk through hinges on identifying the exact moment that Rome's expansion-funded business model stopped functioning. And that moment is closer to 120 than 130. With those corrected, here's the framework. Empires that grow through conquest run on a specific kind of business model. Call it the expansion-funded model. The mechanism is this. Each successful military campaign yields more in return than it costs to execute. The returns include slaves sold in Roman markets, annual tribute from new provinces, land grants for veterans that serve as deferred soldier pay, war booty in silver and gold, control of new trade routes that generate tax revenue indefinitely, and a fresh treasury that pays for the next campaign. The model is self-financing as long as the next conquest yields more than the last one. It's the closest thing to the ancient world had to perpetual motion machine, and it worked for almost 600 years. The model has one fatal structural feature. It assumes perpetual expansion is available. The moment that assumption stops being true, the model is dead. But it takes generations for anyone to figure that out, because the existing wealth from past conquests sustains the appearance of solvency. Every expansion-funded empire in history has hit the same ceiling. Rome hit it in 138. The compounding decay took 338 years to fully play out. Let me walk through the 4 phases. Phase 1 is the model working as designed. For roughly 600 years, Rome ran a sequence of profitable conquests. The First Punic War yielded Sicily. The Second Punic War yielded Spain and the Carthaginian commercial empire. The conquest of Macedonia yielded the wealth of the Hellenistic East. Pompey's eastern campaigns yielded Syria, Judea, and Asia Minor. Caesar's Gallic Wars yielded Gaul and roughly 1 million slaves sold into the Roman economy. Augustus added Egypt, which by itself became roughly a quarter of the empire's grain supply and the personal property of the emperor. The financial logic was straightforward. Each new province paid annual tribute. Each conquest produced one-time war booty. Each war supplied slaves to the Roman labor market. Each settlement of veterans on conquered land served as soldier pay deferred until retirement. The civic and political consequences were profound. Rome could afford a massive professional army. Rome could afford the grain dole that fed hundreds of thousands of citizens. Rome could afford the spectacles, the building programs, the imperial administration. None of it was funded from internal taxation of Italians or Romans. All of it was funded by conquest. The last truly profitable Roman war was Trajan's Dacian campaign in the early 100s. Dacia, which is modern-day Romania, was conquered specifically for its gold mines, which financed Trajan's reign and underwrote a major building program in Rome. The Dacian gold was a one-time windfall, but it was substantial enough to mask, for almost a generation, that the expansion-funded model was beginning to run out of profitable targets. By the time Trajan died in 117, the easy conquests were done. Germania was forested, fragmented, and poor. Conquering it would cost more than the territory was worth. Parthia in the east was holdable only at impossible logistical costs across hostile terrain. The Sahara to the south, the Caucasus to the north, the Atlantic to the west. The empire had grown to the edge of every direction that was economically worth taking. Phase 1 was complete in 117. The expansion-funded model had produced one of the wealthiest civilizations in human history, and the next emperor was the one who would have to figure out what to do when expansion stopped paying for itself. Hadrian inherited an empire at its territorial peak and made a decision that almost nobody expected. He stopped expanding. He pulled Roman forces back from Trajan's eastern conquests in Mesopotamia almost immediately upon taking the throne in 117. He toured the frontiers, the only Roman emperor to personally visit virtually every province in the empire, and he stabilized them. In Britain, he ordered the construction of the wall that bears his name, with work beginning in 122 and largely completed by 128. In Germany, he reinforced the existing lines. In Africa and in the East, he built defensive infrastructure rather than launching new campaigns. The decision was justified at the time as prudent, defensive, and sustainable. The historical record makes Hadrian look like a wise administrator who recognized the limits of further expansion. And in a narrow sense, he was right. Conquering Germania would have cost more than it returned. Holding Mesopotamia would have bled the army. The financial consequence was structural, not tactical. The moment Rome stopped expanding, the expansion-funded business model became insolvent. The fresh treasury from new conquests stopped flowing. The slave supply from defeated populations stopped replenishing. The land available for veteran settlement stopped growing. The annual tribute for new provinces stopped being added to the existing tribute base. From 128 onward, with the wall completed and the defensive policy fully visible, the empire had to fund itself entirely through internal extraction, taxing existing provinces, landowners, existing trade. The fixed assets of the empire, the territory, the population, the productive capacity, were now the entire financial base. There was no new wealth coming in. This is the moment that matters most. Hadrian didn't cause Rome's decline. He recognized a structural reality that already arrived and had made the only sensible decision available to him. But the moment he made that decision, the institution that had funded Rome for 6 centuries was structurally dead. It took 348 years for that death to become visible. The visible signs began almost immediately. Marcus Aurelius, Hadrian's grandson by adoption, spent most of his reign in defensive frontier wars against barbarian tribes that previous emperors would have campaigned to suppress permanently. The Marcomannic Wars were defensive, not expansionist. Marcus Aurelius's meditations were largely written in military camps along the Danube while he tried to hold a frontier that no longer paid for itself. Phase 2 was complete by 128. The empire still looked like the wealthiest civilization on Earth. The business model underneath it had just stopped working. Phase 3, it was what happens when expansion-funded empires try to keep funding itself without expansion. The state has to find new revenue from internal sources, and every available mechanism produces political and economic damage. The first move was heavier taxation of existing provinces. This worked for a generation, but pushed productive landowners off their land and onto the protection of large estates or the church, which is the same flight from taxation mechanism we covered in the Theodosius episode. Each round of heavier taxation shrank the productive tax base, which forced the next round of even heavier taxation on whomever remained. The second move was currency debasement. The Roman silver denarius, which under Augustus had roughly 95% pure silver, began losing silver content under Marcus Aurelius and accelerated through the 3rd century. By 280, the coins were less than 5% silver, essentially bronze with a thin silver wash that flaked off in your hand. We covered the consequences of this in the 3 patterns that killed Rome episode. The empire was inflating its currency to fund obligations the tax base couldn't sustain. The third move was tax base expansion through citizenship. In 212, Caracalla issued the Constitutio Antoniana, the Edict of Caracalla, which extended Roman citizenship to almost every free inhabitant of the empire. The framing at the time was generous. The actual mechanism was fiscal. Romans paid taxes on inheritance. Non-citizens did not. Extending citizenship to 30 million new people overnight gave the imperial treasury a vastly larger inheritance tax base. It also diluted what Roman citizenship had meant for centuries. Being Roman stopped being a status worth earning, because it was now a status simply held by virtue of geography. The fiscal benefit was immediate. The civic cost was permanent. Now, the first clip. Caracalla in 212, he does what's called the Edict of Caracalla, and he names everyone living in the province as a citizen. So now, citizenship doesn't have any real value anymore. So then Diocletian looks at that too, and he actually does some military reforms to try and handle that, because a lot of these guys had the benefits of citizenship, but you used to have to serve in what's called the Roman auxiliary if you weren't Roman to get Roman citizenship, and after you served for 20 years, you could be a Roman.
What was the benefits of citizenship? Why was this a problem?
Because number one, you got more ability to have grain and things like that. You could actually vote. You could actually control an area. You could get political power. But if you didn't have Roman citizenship, you couldn't do any of those things. And to actually have, what would end up happening is these guys would be in the Roman auxiliary. Auxiliary was military, but just not for people that weren't Roman. They would serve for 10, 20, 30 years, whatever it is. Over time that went up, and by the time the auxiliary was gone, you had to serve for 30 years. At the end of it, they would be named a Roman citizen, and now they could go serve in government. And the thing that was nice about that is you could take that citizenship, you could be like, my son is a citizen now, his whole family is a citizen now. So there was a lot of value in that, and you had to earn it. But after 212 and the Edict of Caracalla, so now Rome's supporting all these different people and all these different tribes and things like that didn't have to actually earn that citizenship. So it loses a lot of value. So Diocletian does all these reforms, and it actually stabilizes the empire in 284. And that's actually the thing that makes it last till 476. The fourth move, which played out across the 3rd century crisis, was political. The fiscal pressure produced weak emperors who couldn't pay their armies reliably. Armies that couldn't be paid reliably installed their own emperors, who promised to pay them better. The political system selected the most short-term thinking, most ruthless leaders willing to extract immediate revenue at the cost of long-term institutional stability. 26 emperors in 49 years. Most assassinated by their own troops when the next claimant offered more. Each of these moves was a fiscal emergency response to the same underlying problem. The expansion-funded model had died at Hadrian's Wall, and the entire empire had to fund itself from internal extraction. Each move brought time, but none of them fixed the structural problem. Phase 3 was complete by 284, when Diocletian took the throne with the empire on the verge of formal dissolution. Phase 4 is what we covered in detail in the Theodosius episode. Once the internal extraction model also reaches its limit, the state stops trying to restore the original model and starts managing the decay. Diocletian's reforms in 284 to 305 admitted the reality. The empire was too big for one ruler to manage, so it split to 4, the Tetrarchy. He attempted price controls through the Edict of Maximum Prices in 301, which failed almost immediately because price controls don't create supply. He reformed the bronze coinage. He restructured the military and the administration. Constantine extended the work in the early 300s. The gold solidus was introduced and became the long-lived standard of the late Roman and Byzantine commerce. The army was professionalized further. The capital moved east to Constantinople. Christianity was institutionalized into the state. Each subsequent emperor managed a slightly smaller, slightly poorer, slightly more fragmented empire. The visible institutions, the Senate, the consulships, the legal codes, the religious offices, all continued to exist. The underlying capacity that those institutions had originally represented had been hollowed out across nearly 3 centuries. When the Western political administration formally ended in 476, the empire had already been running on managed decline for almost 2 centuries. Hadrian's Wall to 476 is the timeline of an expansion-funded business model collapsing in slow motion. Phase 4 ended in 476. The institution called Rome stopped existing in the West. The civilization it had built had been ending for centuries. This is the pattern. 4 phases. 6 centuries of expansion-funded growth. A single decision in the early years of Hadrian's reign to stop expanding. Visibly cemented by 128 with the completion of the wall. 3 centuries of internal extraction substitutes that bought time, but didn't fix the structural problem. The final century of managed decline, then the formal end. The mechanism is generalizable. Every expansion-funded empire in history has hit the same ceiling. The British Empire hit it in the early 20th century when the cost of holding the empire exceeded the revenue it generated. The Spanish Empire hit it in the 17th century when the silver from the Americas stopped offsetting the cost of European wars. The Mongol Empire hit it within a generation of conquest stopping. The Ottoman Empire hit it after the failed siege of Vienna ended the Mediterranean and Balkan expansion. The variable isn't whether the ceiling exists. The ceiling always exists. The variable is how long the institution can sustain the appearance of solvency after the model has structurally failed, and what the institution does during that window. Rome's window was 348 years. That's the longest of any expansion-funded empire on record. The Roman institutions were so robust and the existing wealth so substantial that the empire could sustain the appearance of solvency for more than 3 centuries of compounding fiscal failure. That's the part that should be sobering rather than reassuring. The window between the model dying and the institution dying is long enough that nobody inside the institution recognizes the model has died. Every generation believes the current fiscal emergency is the problem, and the next fiscal fix will solve it. None of them recognize that the underlying business model was dead before they were born. James pushed back on the Diocletian framing in our conversation. He said, I quote, "I'm not saying the US is declining," and he was right to push back. The America is Rome frame is lazy when applied directly. America is not an expansion-funded empire in the Roman sense. But the structural question is real. Every economic model has a ceiling. Rome's was expansion-funded. America's is innovation-funded. The America economic model has worked for roughly 250 years because each generation has produced technological and productivity innovations that expand the available economic surface. Railroads, oil, electricity, automobiles, computing, the internet, and now AI. As long as the next innovation expands the surface faster than the existing surface contracts, the model is solvent. The wealth generated by innovation funds everything downstream. The social programs, the defense budget, the federal debt service. The structural question for the innovation-funded model is the same one Rome faced for the expansion-funded model. What happens if the innovations stop being net positive? What happens if the next wave of innovation destroys more economic value than it creates, or concentrates gains so narrowly that the broader system can't fund itself. What happens if the marginal cost of the next innovation exceeds the marginal revenue? The same way the marginal cost of Roman conquest exceeded the marginal revenue at Hadrian's Wall. I don't know the answer. I'm not sure James knows either. I'm not sure anybody does. Because the answer reveals itself only after the model has structurally failed, and the institutions take generations to recognize the failure. Now the second clip.
Everyone's kind of talking that the U.S. is in decline, but the U.S. always sort of pulls success out of a hat, and I think that's because of technological innovation.
Yeah.
I mean, we of course you could argue U.S. is going around trying to conquer countries, but the U.S. doesn't really. It's not like how the Roman Empire would conquer a country where they would take all the wealth and install a governor. There's not really a lot of instances of that in the world in general. I mean, there's
you could make a case for South America in a lot of ways.
Actually, that's true. I mean,
if you've ever read Confessions of an Economic Hitman, look what we've done to South America.
Right. Well, basically, I guess you could say the dollar is our weapon. So we would lend countries money. And by the way, this is what China is now doing with Africa.
Yes.
You would lend countries money, and we lent all of South America. We didn't want South America to be dependent on any other country like the Soviet Union, for instance. So we lent South America a lot of money. They, of course, never were able to pay it back. So we essentially nationalized South America and took over everything, and all of their resources belong to U.S. corporations, more or less. Not completely. I've oversimplified it, but you're right. So South America, in some sense, is a weird kind of vassal of the U.S. But what similarities do you see, in terms of the decline of the Roman Empire with the U.S. right now? And I'm not saying the U.S. is declining. I don't really think it is. But
no, I agree with you.
Similarities.
I think you're right there. What James was describing, the dollar as a financial weapon, sovereign lending as a mechanism of soft empire, is a different kind of expansion-funded model. Not territorial conquest, but financial penetration. The mechanism is different. The structural question is the same. As long as the dollar's reserve currency status holds, the model funds itself. The moment that status weakens, every institution dependent on it has to find another funding mechanism. That's the parallel worth taking seriously. Not America's Rome, but every institution that runs on a perpetual growth assumption. Public pensions, debt service models, asset appreciation markets, university endowment funds, reserve currency status. They face the same structural ceiling that Rome's territorial expansion faced. The question for any institution running such a model isn't whether the ceiling exists. It's whether the people inside the institution will recognize the ceiling before they hit it, or whether they'll spend 338 years of compounding decay, convincing themselves the next fiscal fix is the answer. Rome spent 338 years on that question and never figured it out. The institutions outlived the model by 3 centuries. The civilization outlived the institutions by less than 2. This is how expansion-funded empires actually end. Not at the formal collapse, not at the dramatic invasion, not when the institutions stop existing. They end at the moment the business model becomes structurally insolvent. And almost nobody alive at the moment recognizes it, because the existing wealth sustains the appearance of solvency for centuries. For Rome, that moment was 128, the wall in Britain that pulled back the legions, the pivot from expansion to defense. Everything downstream, the 3rd century crisis, the Diocletian reforms, the Constantine pivot, the Theodosius surrender, and the fall in 476, was the slow compounding of consequence of a structural failure that had already happened. The question for our own moment isn't whether the same pattern can run. The pattern has run in every expansion-funded empire in history. The question is whether the institutions we live inside are running structurally insolvent models we haven't recognized yet, and whether the people responsible for those institutions can identify the ceiling before they hit it. Same playbook, different century. Same result. Unless someone inside the pattern recognizes the structural failure before the slow compounding decay does its work. I'm Jeremy Ryan Slate. This has been The Roman Pattern. I'll see you Monday.